entire life, so I'm just going to savor it for a second. And, you know, in her own right, Katie was just an incredible student, and I'm not at all surprised, but very gratified that she's ended up doing such a cool job for such cool people. So thank you for making my job something that I love to do. And so now I'm going to take this very long dissertation, which I made into a not quite so long book, and I'm going to cram it down into a not at all long presentation, with most of the academic stuff excised from it. I'd like to start by telling a story I think a lot of you are probably familiar with. It's the story of DJ Drama. DJ Drama is one of the most influential mixtape DJs in the world. He is one of the forces to be reckoned with. That's with a capital F and capital K, capital R. Freudian slip. Anyway, you don't want to mess with the man. He has pretty much single-handedly bolstered the distribution of hip-hop in the U.S., not through radio stations, not through iTunes, not through any of the traditional channels, but through barbershops and parking lots and strip clubs and the kind of underground mixtape network that still provides the lifeblood of American hip-hop culture. And this has not gone unrecognized by the major labels, who pay him up to $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a pop to include their signed artists in his mixtapes because of the authenticity and distribution and promotion that it provides. So he was very surprised one morning about 4 years ago when the RIAA showed up at his doorstep with a SWAT team consisting of over 40 people with assault rifles and gun-sniffing dogs. They took away everything, his computers, his cars. They didn't find any drugs, but what they did find was what they claimed was 80,000, what he told me was 20,000 mixtape CDs, contraband. They actually sued him under RICO laws, which is what you use to get Tony Soprano, not somebody who's producing music at the behest of the recording industry. Sometimes those are the same people. So this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? And if you look at the newspaper coverage at the time, Ted Cohen of EMI said that it was typical of the schizophrenic operation of the music industry. I don't really think that's I think that's a description, but it's not an adequate explanation of why this would happen. And so obviously many of you are familiar with Lawrence Lessig and his notion of free culture and this notion that we're at this kind of borderline, this line of scrimmage between the public culture and the private culture. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, but what I look at goes beyond that. And what I'm interested in is the gray area, the rapidly expanding sea of gray area that exists between public and private, between things that are produced and things that are consumed. And that's what I call configurability. The technology and the cultural movements both. I think we now live in a configurable culture. I'll talk a bit more about what that means later. So as it turns out, this notion is a very old notion, the notion that the government should step in and stop people from distributing music. Plato, in his Republic, argued that whoever runs the state has to make sure not to let any musical innovation happen, because when the modes of the music change, the fundamental laws of the state will always change with them, right? So there's a political valence to music that is never absent. Amazingly, the Confucian scholar Shunzi said almost exactly the same thing less than a century later, entirely around the globe, where he said, as singers blend their voices with that of the leader, so good or evil arise in response to the force that calls them forth. The force that calls them forth. And I have to turn off my cell phone so you guys stop getting that annoying interference. And interesting, if you look at the censorship that's happening in China right now, the whole rationale behind what's called the Great Firewall of China is in the name of what they're now calling harmonization. So this Confucian equivalency of musical innovation and social innovation is still the driving principle behind Chinese censorship policies today. And of course, this is a newer idea as well. If anyone's ever seen Yellow Submarine, the first thing the Blue Meanies do when they take over Pepperland is they lock up all the instruments. And as it turns out, this is a remarkably durable idea, the notion that that the states and other invested powers have to lock down on music because it has this amazing, ineffable quality to transform the way that people think and self-organize, and therefore the power relations of society in general. And I've got an entire chapter in my book about why this is the case, which I'm now going to skip over. And what I'm going to say, I'll reduce it to one sentence, which is to say that even though musical regulation is a constant, the ways in which music is conceived of and therefore regulated tells you a whole lot about the society that's doing the regulating and the resisting against that regulation. And we can learn a lot about the direction that society is going to take by looking at the minute battles over music in those societies. So I want to dial forward in time a couple millennia, but not quite to the present day, and talk about this guy. Anybody recognize him? Sorry? Well, that's a good guess, and I'll show you why in a second. His name is Hector Berlioz. He is considered one of the great symphonic composers of all time. He was French. And Berlioz was totally madly in love with this guy in the lower left, who he looked a lot like, not by accident, Ludwig van Beethoven. Berlioz considered Beethoven to be this great genius who was producing the most sublime human expression ever. And he just had a mad crush on him, basically. And this guy in the lower right, Franz Joseph Fétis, he was the big dog in Paris at the time when Berlioz was a young man. He ran a conservatory. His stuff was all up in the opera house. He was super, super popular, influential, and powerful. And Fétis brought out a French edition of Beethoven's work in which he corrected a few of the harmonizations because he thought they just weren't really appropriate and he wanted them to be better, which at the time was a totally standard thing to do. That's just what you did. There was no such thing as a recording at that time, so everything, when music was transmitted from Germany to France or from France to England, copyists would copy it down and print it. And so those copyists would often feel that it was perfectly within their rights to change whatever they thought was appropriate, because it was a living document. But Berlioz went absolutely apeshit, and he basically created a boycott against this publisher, and he wrote an entire opera in which he compared Fétis to a bird that defecates on a statue and struts about as if he laid a golden egg. And he basically destroyed his own career to exalt Beethoven and preserve the privilege of Beethoven's ideas. And, you know, I see this as a turning point in modernity, right? Berlioz was part of a new generation that had a new idea about what music was and how it operates. And his new idea had concepts in it like originality, like genius, like what's known in European copyright law as droit moral, a moral right over the music, that those ideas hadn't existed before his generation. It was a brand new concept, and it was emerging at exactly the same time that the modern state was emerging in the wake of industrialization. So these musical ideas are always very, very tied to the social ideas in which they emerge. And if we look, you know, if you want to get super reductionist about it, you can basically break those new ideas that Berlioz was espousing, what I call the modern framework, down to 6 basic binaries. The notion that there's a difference between art and craft, between an artist and an audience member, that there's a difference between an original and a copy, performance and composition, figure versus ground in music, and materials versus tools. And these all seem like very natural distinctions that any of us would make if asked. They actually didn't really exist before the 17th century, and they weren't really codified until the end of the 18th century with Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment. So these are very, very new and radical ideas that don't apply to the way that most people have seen their creative work during most of human history in most places. And not accidentally, these ideas directly bear upon and reinforce the social ideas that were coming into the fore in political thought during this era, right? The notion that art is superior to craft, right, is this notion of what Marx called commodity fetishization, the notion that certain objects, not by their use value, but by the extra value that we imbue them with, are somehow worth more than other objects. Performance versus composition is a classic example of the division of labor, which is necessary, and necessary for us to see as natural in order for, you know, Fordist industrialization to take place. Right? I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you look at the screen, you can see these musical ideas do not exist in a vacuum. They are code, sonic code for social ideas. And Yeah, sure. The distinction between artist versus audience is a classic kind of classification of people. Well, this 10% of people are the creatives, and then 90% are the consumers. And obviously, the whole production versus consumption dichotomy that underpins, again, what Marx called the alienation of labor, is all premised on this notion that we each have our roles to play in production. The distinction between original versus copy reinforces the notion of monopolization, and with that, the distinction between materials and tools, the notion that music is something where you take a natural substance and you apply tools to it and you make it an artificial or a packaged product, that maps onto to industrial processes of all sorts, right? The way that you build a house is you cut down trees and you turn those trees into logs and you sell the logs to someone and you build a house with the logs. This imposition of this industrialized logic onto the process of making music was something that had not existed. Nobody had thought about music in these terms before this point in time. And again, in my book, I go back through the history of these ideas and trace their genealogies. And of course, the figure versus the ground, this is exactly the moment in time in Western Europe where the notion of the romantic individual standing out against the crowd, the one person becoming the locus of all rights, all responsibilities, all attention, as opposed to the collective, is becoming the new dominant social formation. So all of a sudden we get musics that emphasize figurative elements like melody above the more group dynamics like what's now known as the rhythm section, or what was then known as the harmonization of the accompaniment. Anyway, I could go on about this for hours, but I'm trying to squeeze this very mid-length book into a short presentation. So the problem now, of course, is that that era is at an end. We have a new communications infrastructure that's providing us with a whole new range of capabilities that didn't exist 10 years ago, let alone 50, let alone 200 years ago. And the emergent quality of this new communications infrastructure is to change who we are, to change the way that we think about ourselves, and to change the way that we relate to one another. And most importantly, it undermines all of those assumptions that had seemed so natural to us before. And we've seen this efflorescence of these beautiful, I'm just in love with what I call configurable culture. There's no end to it. There's Counter-Strike is up there that would have fit in with the previous panel. My favorite, of course, is the upper left, this hybridization between lolcats and the Bed Intruder song. And so you don't only get memes like Kenyatta talks about, you get these kinds of hybridization between memes, which become meta memes, which then go on and fuse. There's probably going to be like a video, if there isn't already, of Hitler complaining about the lolcatsization of the Bed Intruder song, and it'll go on and on and on. And it's this beautiful thing, none of which has anything to do with these notions that we thought we had about how culture is made. Who's the artist? Who's the audience member? Right? Is it an art or is it just a craft? What's the original what's the original of the Bed Intruder song? Is it Antoine Dodson? Is it the Huntsville, Alabama news footage? Is it the original iTunes song that was put up by the Gregory Brothers? Is it the Japanese zither remake of it? Or does originality not pertain to this form of cultural production? So what I did was, instead of just doing what a lot of us academics do, which is gazing into my navel and pulling out something, I decided I would actually ask people who have been working on the forefront of these questions for their entire creative lives, namely DJs. And I would also survey Americans at large and ask them questions about how they thought about mashups and remixes and all these other forms of configurable culture. And then I talked to attorneys and record label executives just to make sure that I had the kind of official narrative correct. And what I found was that for each of these binaries, first of all, there's an amazing degree of acknowledgement within the creative communities that the old lines don't exist anymore. Like Eric Kleptone said about art versus craft, he says it's a very gray area. And you see some people reaching back to the history of visual culture, like Duchamp, who somebody mentioned earlier, who put this urinal on a wall and called it fountain and made art history, to people who say that, this is a joke, you may as well let a chimp play a piano. That middle image is actually a Corey Archangel, where I had no idea that we'd be having someone else who remixed Mario here today when I made this presentation. But Corey Archangel took everything out of Mario except the clouds. And it was in an art gallery, and they decided it was art, and it got reviewed in the New York Times, well, I might add. But this thing on the right is just something that someone else, whose name I don't even know, made, which is a Second Life reproduction of a Lady Gaga video that was then posted on YouTube. And there are like millions of those with hundreds of millions, if not billions of views. Are those art? You know, if those are art, then what isn't? This notion of the distinction between the artist and the audience. Again, you get quotes like, that's a gradual, fuzzy thing. What's very interesting to me here is this notion of the bedroom producer. That's something that came out of a lot of my interviews. And everyone would say, well, you know, so-and-so is an artist, but so-and-so is just a bedroom producer. Or some kid in his bedroom, you know, that's not art. But let me tell you who's really an artist. And so there was this kind of straw man. I started wondering, like, who is this kid in his bedroom? This poor kid who doesn't get to be an artist, even though everyone else does. And then I started reading more and more interviews, and I realized that very famous DJs, like DJ Danger Mouse, who's down here on the bottom, who's known for the Black Album, or the Gray Album, and who's now part of Gnarls Barkley, Danger Mouse, you cannot find an interview with him in which the word bedroom does not appear. He says, oh, I came up with the idea for the Gray Album while I was cleaning my bedroom, or I do all of my best work in the bedroom, right? So he's self-applying the term bedroom producer, which is used by other people as a pejorative to exclude them from the right to participate. Doesn't that sound familiar in a way? I mean, it's funny how language does that. It reminds me of nothing more than certain racial epithets, which are really fought over in our culture right now, which can be self-applied as a form of power, and which can be applied to someone else as a form of imposition of power. And you see the same thing even with the term DJ itself. People will self-apply, say, you know, I'm DJ Axel, I'm DJ Food, whoever it is that I interviewed. But a lot of people will use the term DJ as a negative category. That's not composing, that's just DJing. Or that's not performing, that's just DJing. Which takes us to composition. Oh, this is actually original versus copy. We have a lot of acknowledgement within the remix community that that distinction is a fundamentally false distinction. And we have a lot of people playing with that distinction. So if you look at Executioners, which is a turntablist group, they have an album called Built from Scratch, which is a pun because, of course, they're scratching the vinyl, but they're also commenting that even though their materials are all reused, it's essentially a raw material to them. Or The Streets, who says everything is borrowed. And then the Kleptones I didn't have room for on this, but they have an album called Never Trust Originality. So this is a very, very prevalent idea within the DJ community that people have been grappling with. And rather than running from it, they're highlighting the ambiguities between original and copy. If you look at the distinction between composition and performance, that one was impossible for DJs to even define. The closest they could come is saying, well, it's performing if there's someone in the room, and it's composing if you're by yourself, which actually has nothing to do with the way that we use terms like compose and perform. And you see people like on the left, Trademark G of the Evolutionary Control Committee, he spins what he calls a wheel of mashup on stage. Actually, he gets an audience member to come up and spin the wheel, and whatever two acts end up together, he will mash them up on the spot. So that's a way in which they attempt to bring performativity into the process. But I got this great quote from DJ Axel, who's a record label executive by day at Warner Brothers Records. Not Warner Music Group, but Warner Brothers, the film, anyway. So he does licensing all day long. That's his job. And I said, well, are you an artist, or are you performing or composing? And he said, well, you know, I'm producing, and I'm kind of arranging, but I wouldn't say that I'm performing, and I'm not necessarily composing. And then he said, you know what, fuck it, I'm all of that. And it was this beautiful moment where I saw this guy grappling with, he had to fight against, you know, years and years and years of being an agent of this, you know, this ideological system, and then he just cast it off, you know, with one F-bomb, which was just beautiful. And then if you look at the distinction between figure and ground, I think this is probably one of the most interesting distinctions, is that, you know, we now live in a schizophonic society, right? We're wearing our earbuds, and we're listening to our music, which might itself be a mashup, and then we're walking into a Starbucks where they're playing a different song, and then someone starts with the industrial noise of making the mochaccino or whatever it is that they're making at the Starbucks. And you've got these many, many different levels of sound. And the music is being made now with the expectation that it will only be one layer in a multi-layered sonic landscape. And at the same time, it's sampling that outside sound and bringing it back into the music. It's almost like if you've ever made bread in one of those big machines, the way the dough gets folded over and over and over again. The same thing is happening with our sonic environments. And when you look at a mashup, technically it's the foreground of one song mashed with the background of another song. But some people, like in the hip-hop community, I interviewed this classic hip-hop DJ named Steinsky, who did The Lessons, who's just incredible. And he said, depending on how deep into hip-hop you are, you may not even need a foreground. They'll just sit, they'll smoke a joint and listen to the same beat going around for an hour and be perfectly happy. His words, not mine. It's so this notion of these strictly delineated musical formalistic elements have flown out the window with sample-based music. And lastly, the distinction between tools and materials. Does anyone recognize this image on the lower left? It's called Bird in Space. It's by a sculptor named Brancusi. And back when it was first created at the kind of dawn of the kind of sleek Art Deco modern era, an American collector tried to buy one of them and import it into the country. Now, we have laws that say when you import art into the country, there's no tariff on it. But when you import anything else, you have to pay a tariff. So the customs inspectors stopped Bird in Space from getting into the country because, according to the words of Chief Inspector Crack, I'm not making this up, he said it was, quote, a manufacture of metal. So he refused to believe that it was art, and they actually went to court, and it took 2 years for them to decide, for the customs court, to decide that it was not in fact a manufacture of metal, but a work of art, and therefore he didn't have to pay tariffs. Well, I would say if you look at the lower right, this is a waveform in a standard, DSP environment. This is what every single digital DJ looks at every day of their lives right now. Looking at it, can you say that this is art or not? Can you say whether it's a material that they're using or a tool that they're using or the finished product? No. There's no way formalistically to see those roles. They become completely fluid. One person's beginning is another person's endpoint, and so on and so forth. And so this industrial metaphor that we've used to understand music, we're going to go out and conquer the natural world, bring it into the marketplace, and make ourselves wealthy and make the world a better place, that just doesn't functionally apply to the way that music is actually made anymore. So what does this mean for our society? Well, I pulled out 5 key points about what I think the new social ideas that are replacing the ones that have become so untenable might look like. And as always with prognostication, I'm going to end up being wrong in all kinds of amazingly wonderful ways. But I think these are still very useful to try to create a conversation around the kinds of creative behaviors that we've seen so many panelists talking about today. So the first one is what I call configurable collectivism. And it could be called configurable individualism too, because what it really means is that impermeable boundary separating the individual from the group that defines modernity as an era is disappearing. Right? I am he is you are he is you are me, and we are all together, in the words of a slightly earlier musician. Or in the words of Girl Talk, this shit is not about me, it's about all of us because we're the same motherfucking person. So take a picture of your goddamn self because we're all the same dude. That's actually the epigraph of my book. And I think that really sums up in a nutshell what the ethic of configurability is about, right? This sudden realization that we are not these lone particles bumping into each other in a formless void, but we're more like fish who are ingesting and excreting the same ocean water over and over again and reproducing in it. It's a big mess. Life is messy if nothing else, and so is art. But we're all elements of this large churning cultural process rather than individual members who are able to stand outside from it and judge it from afar. The second idea is called the reunion of labor. So I talked before about how Marx said that labor was becoming alienated. The shoemaker doesn't know the person who's wearing the shoes. The person who makes the front of the car doesn't know the person who's making the back of the car, so on and so forth. But if you look at the way that DJs work, they're much less regimented and much more flexible and modular in their work. So if you look on the left, we have a picture of the modern orchestra, right, which is the model of industrial production. You have, on the left-hand side, you have the audience, right? They're the consumers. And then next to the audience, you have the conductor. The conductor is the foreman. It's his job to tell everybody else what their job is. Then you have the string section, and you have the brass section, and you have the woodwinds, and you have percussion, et cetera, and each of those sections is doing their own little bit. Now, I'm not dissing orchestral music. I'm a giant Wagner fan, and I always will be, despite the many reasons why I shouldn't be. But the point is that this music existed not only to entertain people and enlighten people, but also to model a form of social organization that was necessary to model at that point in time. Now look at how DJs work, right? When you have multiple DJs working together, they'll just be side by side, and you can't tell who there is spinning beats and who's dropping samples and who's laying on effects. Maybe they're taking turns, who knows, right? More and more you don't even see the DJs next to each other, right? When you're working with mashups, one person in Germany will take an a cappella, and then somebody in Zimbabwe will put some beats behind that, and somebody in Philadelphia will add some accompaniment, and you've got 90,000 versions of the same song. So to my mind, that really betokens a sense that we are all, as knowledge workers in this changing environment, becoming much more modular people. And if you look at the trends, people don't build careers like, I worked for IBM since I was 17, and now I got my gold watch, and now I got my pension. That's not the way that labor works anymore. We're all, really, we're solo, but we're also enmeshed in these communities, like this room itself, where we're all retweeting each other's tweets, and we're producing this community. You're probably tweeting that tweet right now. We're producing this collective, collaborative community between us, not out of altruism, but because that's actually the model for production that economically and socially works for us right now, given this new platform. The third is the inversion of public and private. Obviously, we have surveillance up the wazoo these days, both online and in the real world with the ring of steel. You can't walk around New York or London without being followed by a camera. It's only getting more and more pervasive. What I would say is that just once you cease to be as concerned about the individual versus the crowd, the notion of public and private becomes a lot fuzzier too, right? And this happens in a number of ways. First of all, in the old days, you would hear some music and you'd think about it, and then you'd play your own version of that music. That's what like Dexter Gordon was doing when he was riffing about Stevie Wonder on the tenor saxophone. But now, when you remix music, you're doing it on the computer where everyone else can see and hear the processing as it's happening. The computer processing is tied deeply to the cognitive processing in the very same moment, and it's all audible and visible to everybody else around you, right? So what was once interior is now exterior. Now, to my mind, the only distinction between culture and cognition is that culture is the spreading of ideas and the transformation of ideas outside of you, and cognition is the spreading and transformation of ideas inside of you. Once that boundary erodes, there's no longer the same distinction between the two. And we're going to increasingly see that as our bodies are augmented by networked processors that are drawing information from without and spewing it back out through the various channels that we have at our behest. I think the ads for the iPod have really drawn this into relief also, right? What is the ad for the iPod, right? The negative space is what used to be the foreground, right? The human being is negligible, and what the iPod is about is the public space that's defined by the layering of sonic material one on the other. And it resembles, to me, nothing so much as the famous optical illusion, what's called a Rubin vase, where you see two faces or you see the vase. Anyway, I could go on at length about that. I think it's pithy, but I won't. And then the fourth principle is the shift from linearity to recursion. This is really more of, there's an academic argument here, which is that we think in terms of linear logical ideas. And there are people who have argued that this has been going on. In fact, Plato was one of the first to argue this, that since we invented writing from left to right, or right to left, or top to down, but from left to right over and over and over again, we developed not just the capacity to express ourselves that way, but we began to think about the world in terms of A leads to B, and B leads to C, and C leads to D. And that new logic took over and became dominant. We are now seeing linearity no longer become the dominant platform for the production and dissemination of ideas, and I expect we will see a shift in the very apparatus by which we decide what's true and isn't true. The act of logic, the act of deciding how to make sense of the world, I think will become something that looks a lot more networked and a lot less linear, even as our linear supply chains in the factories give way to what's here on the right is it's a sequencer built in Max MSP, which is a software programming language where you drag objects and build connections between them, and cool stuff happens. That's pretty much all I know about it. I've tried to use it. I'm not that expert in it yet. But no, this distinction between stuff gets made that way and stuff gets made that way is percolating through our entire culture, and we're beginning to argue in a different way. In fact, as I say in my book, I think my argument, which is pretty linear, is already outmoded, and I'm writing a book about why I'm obsolete and becoming obsolete in the process of writing it. So, too bad for me, really good for my kids. Then the last principle is what I call DJ consciousness. And W.E.B. Du Bois, the great social theorist of a century ago, coined this term double consciousness. And what he meant by that was that the African American experience is unique in many ways because black people in America are forced to see themselves both as subject and object, both from within and without. But this wasn't just a challenge, as many theorists have picked up on and argued. It's a strength, right? The reason that African American culture has been so influential around the world is because it's so rich with different meanings and is so able to say different things to different groups. I was just last night having dinner with a friend of mine who teaches music at Georgetown, and he was telling me about this contemporary of Alan Lomax's, who used to do field music recordings in the American South back in the 30s. And this guy was walking down the street when he came upon a chain gang, and when he heard them around the corner, they were singing this very violent song about, let's kill the white oppressor, basically. And then he walked down the street, and they saw him, and the song suddenly morphed into being about a cat in a basket. So he walked back down the street, and then he snuck around again through the woods and set up his recording equipment, and this recording exists out there now. And the song became about, like, there goes that white man, the laziest man I ever saw. Anyway, so there's reams and reams and reams of libraries full of books about that subject. But what's very interesting to me is that configurable culture has adopted the logic of double consciousness into what I call DJ consciousness, right? Where everybody is hearing themselves both from within and from without at the same time, seeing themselves as elements in a larger system, and transacting their work in the marketplace of ideas as well as the economic marketplace. Seeing themselves as producer and consumer at the same time, as artist and audience member at the same time, seeing their work as both a material for someone else and a finished product for themselves. And configurable culture is now mainstream. I've done quantitative research, which I didn't have time to share with you, but the majority of American adults are now engaging in practices that we would recognize as configurable because they're neither pure production nor pure consumption. So what does it mean that the new mainstream adopts the logic and the symbolism and the language of the most oppressed minority in the history of our nation, right? Maybe we are all coming to see ourselves as marginal. Well, if that's the case, then what's at the center? And I think, the active globe with Mickey Mouse here is the answer. I think that increasingly, even though we're not motivated to see this explicitly, we are collectively as a society defining ourselves in apposition and opposition to the increasingly centralized control over the distribution of information in our society, as exemplified by information monopolists like Google or AOL or what have you, as well as the new treaties and laws that we're seeing passed. Earlier on, Gigi mentioned ACTA, but that's only the tip of the iceberg, right? We have the new POICA bill, which the Senate introduced in the last session, which essentially gives the DOJ unilateral unchecked power to censor entire domains for the entire American public. This is a make or break moment in terms of law and policy for our society. And in order for all of the benefits of configurable culture to flourish and to continue to help us transform ourselves and make the world more interesting and more innovative in ways that are going to benefit us psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, and financially, we need to understand that there is a concerted and highly capitalized and highly strategized effort going on right now in Washington and elsewhere to make sure that that doesn't happen by eliminating network neutrality, by imposing 3 strikes rules on all signatories of treaties that would kick people off the internet for the crime of being accused of copyright infringement. And the list goes on and on and on, and now is not the time to say it. But what I would say is that I have finally come around to the point myself, after writing this and after doing this research and talking to these people, that I'm beginning to think that the only solution is to reinvent the platform itself, to create a platform that is inherently decentralized and cannot, a non-monopolizable communications infrastructure. And that's actually a work that I'm going to be doing with some of my graduate students this spring. And anybody who's interested in talking about what that new infrastructure or alternative infrastructure might look like, come up and talk to me afterwards, and we'll network or bump iPhones or something like that. So again, thank you all for having me. It's a real privilege and honor to be speaking here, and I'm delighted to be in the room with all of you. Thank you.